Lesson 3, Jackson and the Bank. Please be sure to do thieves before reading through this whole lesson. Jackson and the Bank. Essential question: how do governments change? In this cartoon, President Jackson holds up an order removing federal deposits from the bank. The men scurrying away are newspaper publishers, bankers, and other bank supporters. The story begins. Andrew Jackson opposed the idea of a federal bank that was controlled by private bankers. He vetoed a bill that would have renewed the charter for the Second Bank of the United States to continue operation. Jackson argued in part, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven, and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles." Analyzing key ideas and details. Read carefully to identify the actions taken by President Jackson that put the Bank of the United States out of business. Record those actions in a diagram like this one. Bank of the United States closes. Analyzing key ideas and details. Number 1, determining meaning. Explain what Jackson is referring to in the statement, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Number 2, analyzing point of view. What did Clay and Webster believe would happen if they forced Jackson to take action against the bank? Determining meaning. Write a short paragraph about Andrew Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States that includes the word veto. Jackson's war against the bank. Guiding question. What events occurred when President Jackson forced the National Bank to close? Andrew Jackson disliked the Second Bank of the United States long before he became president. Congress had set up the bank in 1816 to hold the federal government's money and to control the nation's money supply. Private bankers, rather than elected officials, ran the bank. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, represented everything Jackson disliked. Jackson prided himself on being a self-made Western pioneer who had started with nothing. Biddle came from a wealthy Philadelphia family and had a good education and experience in financial matters. In addition, the bank's assigned duties made it a powerful institution. Many Western settlers depended on being able to borrow money to run their farms. The bank's strict policies made such loans difficult to obtain. Like many other Westerners, Jackson viewed the bank as a monopoly that favored wealthy Easterners and limited Western growth. The bank and the election of 1832. Jackson's opponents planned to use the bank to defeat him in the 1832 presidential campaign. Senators Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were friends of Biddle. They persuaded Biddle to apply early for a new charter, a government permit to run the bank, even though the bank's charter did not expire until 1836. They thought this would force Jackson to take action against the bank. Clay and Webster believed that the bank had the support of the American people. They thought that if Jackson tried to veto or reject the renewal of the bank's charter, he would lose support. Henry Clay wanted to run for president. He and Webster believed that Jackson's veto would help Clay defeat the president in the 1832 election. Jackson was sick in bed when the bill to renew the bank's charter came to him to sign. He told Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson vetoed the bill. He argued that the bank was unconstitutional despite the Supreme Court's decision to the contrary in McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819. Webster and Clay were right about one thing. The bank did play a large part in the election of 1832. Instead of gaining support for Clay as president, however, their plan backfired. Most people supported Jackson's veto, and Jackson was re-elected. Jackson then decided to kill the bank, even before its current charter ended. He ordered all government deposits withdrawn from the bank and placed in smaller state banks. In 1836, he refused to sign a new charter for the bank, and it closed. Jackson's opponents compared him to a bad king, a tyrant with too much power. Integrating visual information. What is the meaning of the documents that appear at Jackson's feet? So here we have King Andrew I, born to command. Had I been consulted, of veto memory. Here he's holding veto, the veto power. And you can see it says Constitution of the United States. And here it talks about the National Bank. The Panic of 1837. Jackson decided not to run for a third term in 1836. The Democrats chose Van Buren, Jackson's vice president, during his second term. The Whigs, a new party that included former National Republicans and other anti-Jackson forces, were the opposition. The Whigs nominated 3 candidates. Each had support in a different part of the nation. The Whigs hoped this tactic would keep Van Buren from getting a majority of the electoral votes. Then, the election would be decided by the House of Representatives, which the Whigs controlled. The Whigs' plan failed. Jackson's popularity and support helped Van Buren win both the popular and the electoral vote. Van Buren had barely taken office when a financial panic hit the nation. The panic was in part an effect of Jackson's victory over the Bank of the United States. When the bank ceased operations in 1836, control over state banks vanished. Some of these banks began issuing huge amounts of banknotes. Concerned that these notes had little value, the government stopped accepting them as payment for purchasing public land. People began to question the value of their banknotes, leading to economic panic. The Panic of 1837 led to a depression, a severe economic downturn. Land values dropped and banks failed. Thousands of businesses closed. Many workers lost their jobs, and farmers lost their land. In cities across the nation, many people could not afford food or rent. One Mississippi newspaper described the situation, stating, "Never in the history of Mississippi has there been such a pressure in monetary affairs as at the present, and never, we imagine, has the future been shrouded in a deeper and more portentous gloom than at this time." Analyzing primary sources. Number 1, analyzing text, presentation. What is the tone of this article? List some of the words that help create that tone. Number 2, analyzing sources. What prospect is the writer referring to in the text that says the prospect is frightful to contemplate? Here in the city of Vicksburg and the country of Warren, the darkest days of 1837 presented but a faint picture to what is now exhibited, and from every town and county in the state we have the same melancholy prospect. The whole community is literally upon the rack, and the best men in the country find it impossible to raise any amount of money except at the most ruinous sacrifices. When or from whence relief is to come, we know not. But unless relief does come, and come speedily, this country will present a scene of widespread ruin and desolation, such as had never been witnessed before. The prospect is frightful to contemplate. Vicksburg Whig, 1837. This cartoon blames President Van Buren's policies for the Panic of 1837. Van Buren is standing second from the right. President Van Buren did little to ease the crisis. He believed in the principle of laissez-faire, that government should interfere as little as possible in the nation's economy. However, Van Buren did persuade Congress to create an independent federal treasury in 1840. This meant that the government no longer had to deposit its money in private banks as it had been doing. It would keep its money in the federal treasury instead. This new system prevented state and private banks from using government money to back their banknotes. It helped prevent further bank crises. Calling it a second Declaration of Independence, Van Buren and his supporters hailed the passing of the federal treasury law. Still, members of Van Buren's own Democratic Party joined the Whigs in criticizing the act. The split in the Democratic Party gave the Whigs a chance to win the presidency in 1840. Checking for understanding. Number 1. Analyzing issues. What was the purpose of the new treasury system? Number 2. Identifying effects. What were some of the major effects of the Panic of 1837? The Whigs in power. Guiding question. What events occurred during the 1840s that led to the weakening of the Whig Party? When Van Buren ran for re-election in 1840, Democrats had held the White House for 12 years. Now, with the country still in the depths of depression, the Whigs thought they had a chance to win the presidency. Although the Whigs' tactics or methods failed to win the presidency, in 1836 different tactics propelled William Henry Harrison into the White House in 1840. Number 1. Patterns and movement. Which states that supported Van Buren in 1836 turned to Harrison in 1840? Number 2. Exploring region. What factors might explain the shift in support for the two parties shown in these maps? So if we look at the election of 1836, we could see the legend or key. Blue says Van Buren. Van Buren was a Democrat. Red is Harrison, and he was a Whig. White was also a Whig, and he's in yellow. Green is for Webster, who was also a Whig. Purple is for Magnum, and he was just anti-Jackson. And this gray color here is just showing the territories. So these were not states yet. So you can see who won the electoral vote. They need to have more than half to win. And this shows the popular vote. So this was all mixed. And then here you can see who won the states, because remember for the electoral vote they vote by state. So who won the majority of states in the election of 1840 changed. In the election of 1840 we can see that red was for Harrison, part of the Whig Party. Blue was Van Buren, a Democrat. So you can see who won the majority of electoral votes, the majority of state votes, and who won the most votes overall, the popular vote.